My name is Quinn Stephens. I'm 37. I live in the Chicagoland area, and I spent a few years, about 3 years, I would say, as a full-time indie game developer, mostly an artist, but I did do a decent amount of coding towards the end. After that, I transitioned to working as a mobile software developer, and I'm still doing that now professionally. And I did do a few indie games of my own in the year after I quit the game job, but I kind of tapered off from that, and my interests have gone more towards just creating art, paintings, and comics in particular since then.
Gotcha. So, yeah, as I mentioned, like that was sort of my sense was, you had sort of left games behind, at least as I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how you would articulate it or frame it. Like left it like as a career, as a job. Like, are you trying to do something else with that energy? Like, do you feel like it's a thing you left behind? Like, are these sort of ridiculous, arbitrary lines in the sand that I'm asking you to explain about? And maybe you don't think about it that way.
No, I feel like it was a pretty big shift. I mean, maybe less the shift away from games specifically, and more the shift away from being like a co-owner and runner of a small business, which I should probably put in big scare quotes because like I was the least involved in any of the actual business stuff that we did, and the company would never have survived without the two friends of mine who I was working with. They were the ones who really, I think, kept the train moving, and I was kind of along for the ride for a lot of it. But yeah, it was a big change, and I was a little surprised at how quickly I burned out on games. I was initially, and I can go into more of how that whole experience was, but after we stopped working on the game full time, or at least I did, I was very excited initially to do my own games, and I think just once I realized just how much time went into even these incredibly simple ideas that I didn't necessarily feel that passionate about, I just really wanted to finish them.
Yeah.
That it was hard to, especially because also I was still doing software development as a job, and that was making doing it in my spare time a lot less appealing, which was actually what happened during the game. When I was developing the game and I was doing just the art, I did almost none of my own art, just for like fun during that entire period. And that was kind of weird and frustrating for me because I still wanted to, I still had ideas, but I just never had any energy for it.
And so, I'm sorry, I can't remember if you said this before or after I pressed record. So how long ago did you sort of make that shift?
We started working on the game initially in late 2011, and I started doing it full time, I think, in 2012 or maybe beginning of 2013. So I guess it wasn't really 3 years of full time work, but it felt the whole process kind of the whole experience sort of melts together. It was late 2014 when I moved over to doing mobile development, and so 2015 was kind of my year as doing my own thing in games, and I didn't really do it after that.
Right.
There was a weird little phase where I was trying to do kind of like a visual novel. I started like building my own system for this. Like I wanted to do like something that was between a comic and a visual novel and like just like a video game cutscene, really. And I spent a ton of time on it, and eventually kind of abandoned it because I was starting to it just was becoming a bigger project than I wanted it to be, and I just ended up doing it as a video, and then nobody watched the video, so I kind of was a little disheartened by that. Which is, I mean, it's you can put up any content and no one will watch it. It's very easy to have people ignore your stuff, so I don't know if it necessarily reflects on the content or just, it was impossible to get noticed, but I didn't feel like anyone I showed it to was particularly excited with the things I was trying to do with the format. Because I was really doing it. I was trying to solve a problem for me as a creator that I don't think was solving a problem for people as readers or viewers. And I think that was, yeah.
Well, I mean, it still sucks. I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, it's a thing that you kind of mentioned in our more recent emails where you were saying that, like, even though it's been a couple of years away, or a couple of years since you've been more actively involved and you've been away in the years since. I mean, you said that just like from everything you've heard, and I'm just going to quote back to you, you said that video game talent is still treated as expendable and people are just worked into the ground until they quit. I guess you're referring there to like the bigger budget space. So, I mean, I don't know if the question is like, are you surprised or are you not surprised, like the degree to which things have changed or maybe not changed since you were more active?
I wouldn't say I'm surprised. Yeah. And I mean, and this is all secondhand too. I never had any experience in the AAA industry. Right. The closest was we did when we had an office, Bytefin, the company that I was part of, we did squat in the RoboMoto offices. We didn't squat, actually, we were paying rent, but we were, it felt like, it didn't feel like, I shouldn't say it felt like squatting, because they were very friendly. The RoboMoto, when they still existed, they had a nice office in the West Loop. Before Google moved in and made that area super trendy, it was actually still kind of like a weird little kind of industrial feeling nowhere land.
Yeah.
We were there for a bit, and so we sort of got to see a little bit of what they were doing, but they weren't like a huge studio. And they didn't, I have no idea what it was like to work there, really. Like, I wasn't hanging around them enough and seeing enough of their working process to know, because we just kind of went into our office and did our own thing. Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you, please go ahead.
So the whole state of the industry thing is mostly what I continue to read in articles, and I was mostly reading it in articles back then, or maybe hearing about it in GDC talks, possibly, because I did go to GDC for a few years. That was my closest connection to the bigger game sphere. But yeah, I guess I'm not really surprised that it's still like that, because it seems like a pretty easy cycle to sustain as long as you have fresh, young talent who doesn't really value their work and their time enough, and you can get them to work for you for not enough money, for very long hours and bad conditions. I mean, it's the same thing in the visual effects industry too. Is something I've heard more since then, and that was another field that I was very seriously considering entering, and I'm glad I didn't do that either.
Yeah, I mean, I know you didn't. I know you haven't worked in the bigger budget space. I think the other quote I was thinking of, also, recently, it was just that like you've heard, similarly, that like it's even harder to have a breakthrough success than when you were a game developer, which is really saying something. So I don't know if this is an extension or part of what you were talking about from the bigger budget space, but like from what you've heard, like how has it gotten harder? Like harder how?
This actually did hear from Mike Lawrence, one of my friends who was in Bytefin with me. He was kind of when our game Deep World ended, which was last summer. He posted a little bit about it and kind of what the experience had been like and what had changed. And he mentioned that at least in the mobile space, which our game was a desktop and mobile game, but we made most of our money and had most of our audience on the iPad, and the space had just become just these very large companies who could sink millions of dollars into, who could lose millions of dollars basically for a while on a game as they built up an audience and, kind of fine-tuned their, in-app purchases and all that, and all the metrics they needed to try to draw in the audiences they needed. And that was just so hard to compete with as a small team. And I don't believe have put anything else out publicly since then, even though I know Mike still had some ideas and was playing around with some other stuff, but I don't think they've actually released anything since.
Yeah.
So I think that, just that it's not that like you just don't have that much room to fail when you're small. And I guess that's a problem in general with any kind of small business, and any kind of entertainment you're producing.
I don't know though, because like I know from like people I've met through through these interviews, or people I've met, however, who are trying to make stuff at the same scale you're talking about elsewhere. Like up in Canada, like they're able to sort of get grants, or there are endowment programs that support works of that size, teams of that size to make games, and not being a game developer myself, like I'm not aware to the extent that stuff like that may or may not be available in the United States. I don't really understand why it isn't. I mean, does stuff like that exist and I'm just not plugged into that sort of stuff, or is it actually harder down here, for teams of that size because there just aren't resources like that?
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, there probably are like small business grants and stuff out there you could find, but yeah, generally, I don't get the sense that the U.S. is pretty great with grants. Pretty much ever since the '80s, I think there were a lot more artistic grants in the '70s and earlier. Because I've known some people in Europe who were able to, string together some grants.
Yeah.
For their games and stuff like that too. So definitely, it's out there, and yeah, I mean, obviously, people still do it. Like, certainly, people are still putting out small games, and the Switch, interestingly, has been a bit of an indie boon as well. That had a similar kind of gold rush feel to it for a bit there, like the iPhone did. I'm not sure what that scene is like. I know that the Switch eShop is not great for discoverability, really, which is a complaint that people have had about the App Store forever.
Right.
So I'm sure it's hard to get noticed there too.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if that moved the needle at all. It might have at least inspired a lot of small teams to try something, because I know I would be much more excited to have a game on a Nintendo console than to have it on a phone.
Yeah.
Just from the nostalgia perspective, if nothing else.
Although we say that, and I've heard that before, and I wonder if, 15, 20 years, if there will be, future developers who will have a similar nostalgia for having their stuff on an iPhone. I don't know that I've heard that before. I guess it's entirely possible, though.
Yeah. I'm curious. I don't really play mobile games much at all, but when I do glance at the App Store, I don't see any real massive changes there since, I was more into them. I'm curious if the audience and the games that are popular have shifted at all, because the iPhone itself was already super popular when we were developing Deep World, and I don't think that its install base is practically everybody. So there was kind of nowhere to go from there. I don't know if they've hooked other people on games who didn't play them in the interim or not. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's not really a good segue into this, but that was sort of, why I just wanted to make sure before we started to just clarify that, that you have left is, I feel like it's been a while since I've had a conversation like this with someone who had been in the space and left. It's always interesting to hear sort of when you leave and you go somewhere else, what are the new industry's perceptions of games, or of game workers, or of game workers and their habits, or do people not really know sort of what you used to do, and do you not really talk about it?
Talk about it a bit. I started actually getting much more visible about my artistic stuff at work. Probably a couple years in, I started printing out my artwork and just putting it on my desk area, because I kind of realized after a few conversations with people that they just didn't know that I did that stuff, and I guess I sort of assumed they would kind of figure it out. I don't really like tooting my own horn too much, but I do like to be noticed, and I like people to enjoy the work I do. I'm just always trying to find that fine line where I'm not being obnoxious about it. But after a certain point, I realized there's nothing wrong with just putting up some art, and then I can say I made that if people ask about it. I do find that the conversation about games is it's not a huge thriving conversation at my company, really, even though a lot of us play them. And I think it's interesting that as software developers, I don't feel like there was ever much of a sense that the games industry was that similar to what we were doing, or that there was any kind of parallels between our work and the work of someone developing a game.
Yeah.
I think there's people who are very into games who I work with, but I don't think any of them have much interest in making them. I did do a couple little lunch and learns where I showed the basics of Unity to people, and they were really interested, but none of them turned around and made games, even though they certainly could have. They had the technical know-how for it.
Well, they probably heard how hard it is.
That's true. I'm sure I spent a lot of time complaining.
Oh, not from you.
Like,
I don't know. That does seem to be a perception about it. I mean, I had heard from some other people I had talked to who maybe don't always necessarily go from like one type of software development to another as you have, but like I've heard all sorts of stuff about like people think like game developers like have sloppy work habits, that
yeah.
they're lazy. I don't know. It's all these like strange negative connotations of people coming over from that world. I've heard it from a bunch of people, and I don't know why that is, but I also don't know if that's still the reputation because it's been a couple of years since I've heard something like that.
I wouldn't be shocked if that's. I mean, I feel like I never really saw other people's code.
Yeah.
But I did watch a very funny talk at GDC with one of the guys who worked on Fez, the one who I think did most of the actual development of it, like the coding.
Yeah.
That is to say. He told this horror story of like finishing the game, shipping it, and like launch day hit, and he went on vacation. Like that next day, the day after the game launched, he went on vacation, and he was stunned that the game was full of horrible bugs and desperately needed fixes because suddenly many thousands of people were playing it and discovering all this stuff. And I was just kind of like, how could you not know that would happen? But I think that there's a certain level of like rigor that you didn't, at least back then, tend to see in game development, at least like on the indie scale. Like, I mean, if you're building like, the Unreal Engine, you probably had a computer science background and you probably knew a lot of this stuff already. Like what can go wrong. Although computer science doesn't necessarily prepare you for, the realities of like having code in production, which is really just something you have to learn on your own. But it is interesting being a mobile developer is kind of like straddling these worlds a little bit. I think that mobile developers are often kind of scruffy weirdos who are largely self-taught. A lot of us, including the other main mobile developer I work with, Ed, both of us got started with Flash development back when that was like a cool thing to do. And I think it's just like Flash development. It tends to draw people in who are interested in the kind of they're interested in building things and in visually putting stuff together and don't necessarily have any kind of computer science background. They just like are excited to use tools that allow them to build things, and they kind of figure stuff out for themselves.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily lead itself to great habits, although both of us have gotten a lot better. When I started my current job, I like, it's weird to think back of just how much I did not know and how much I didn't know. Like how sloppy my skills really were. And I'm glad I was able to like build it into something where I feel like I actually have some authority now as like a more senior developer.
Well, I mean, maybe this is too strong of a word, but when you left, which I guess like I realized like you still have access to your computer and your keyboard and your mouse, like you can always come back to it if you want or you feel like it. Like, do you feel like, trying to make a go of it as a game developer and then stepping away, like, was there a part of you that was mourning the loss of something or mourning the potential of something or mourning, like, goals? Maybe you had things, maybe you were hoping you might be able to do in or with games?
Yeah, I've had a lot of feelings about that over the years. I have a complicated relationship with ambition, and I feel like when I left, I remember one of the things that was very striking about the whole experience was, even though it was a really cool opportunity and everything was very great on paper, I was rarely really feeling fulfilled or satisfied with the work I was doing at any given moment. And like I said, I didn't have the energy to do my own creative work, and suddenly that was, very green grass on the other side of the fence. Was all these cool artsy things I wanted to do that were not going to make any money, but I just didn't have the energy. And I had the time, something that now as a parent, because I was not a parent at the time, I can really appreciate. Like, I could have done that stuff, but I just didn't have it in me.
Yeah.
And in some ways that was a bit of a relief. It was nice to have the experience of like really trying to make it like in a creative field, without a lot of clear boundaries and with a lot of risks and not enjoy it, because then it like gave me an excuse to not continue that path because it was weird and scary. And I've never been as adventurous as I want to be, or as I like to think of myself as. I've often made comfortable and safe choices, and I don't think that's a great way to live your life necessarily. But yeah, it was very interesting. Like, so for a while I was really set on this, you know what? I just want to do my artistic stuff for fun. I don't want to have to worry about the business aspects of it. I just want a job that I enjoy, and I'm just going to do my stuff on the side, and that's great. But then that started to kind of wear away after a few years, and I wouldn't say I'm 100% happy with my current setup either, even though I actually have a great job and work with great people. And especially right now, it feels incredibly like entitled for me to complain about that. I mean, I'm still employed. I'm in a pretty sought after position. So this stuff, I feel like a lot of these thoughts have been on hold for a few months for obvious reasons, but,
right.
But I do still, there's definitely still part of me that's like, I should really just try this again, but I should try to do it my way. There's a lot of reasons why I might not have enjoyed that other outing. Maybe I should try to be someone creative and be a big deal. And there's a few people I've known when I was younger. This especially gets very strong when I think about or I spend any time with people I knew when I was younger who've gotten very successful creatively, because I see that it can be done like they did it. And I think that most of what I'm lacking there is just the real drive to keep trying that. But of course now I have 2 kids, as I mentioned, and a mortgage, and it's a little bit harder to take financial risks, at least right this moment.
Well, something else I've heard through the years too is just sometimes developers are frustrated about, it sounds too charged to say lack of transparency, but just the general inability to know, like, people who have achieved great success, like, how did they float in the time until they did it? Like, were they subsisting on, like, contracts that they felt weren't glamorous and didn't broadcast, like, hey, this is work they were doing? Like, are they, still living with their folks? Did they get a loan from their parents or parents-in-law? Like, it's all the sort of unglamorous side of what it takes to support those risks. And so I've heard from developers, often, some more than others, that it kind of can be crazy making, because you imagine someone else who's achieving all these great things, like, never had to make sacrifices, or like it didn't, like, it's hard to know, and it's hard to gauge, and I think it's unhealthy in general to, like, compare your path to somebody else's path. And I don't know if there's a degree more of it in games than elsewhere. But I guess, like, you're talking about, like, oh, you could do it differently this time, and you would know the sort of risks you would want to take. Like, was that a thing that was sort of feeding into the way your previous company was working? Was sort of like comparing themselves to other small teams, other companies, or is this a thing?
Yeah, it did.
Felt personally, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I just turned a fan on. Do you hear the sound in the background?
I do not.
Okay, great.
But I'm
just checking, because
comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm not messing up the audio.
No, you're good.
Great. It did not help that our game was heavily inspired by Minecraft. Right after that really exploded, and that, of course, is at the time was the indie dev's dream to become that big of a smash hit. Maybe a little bit less so now that we've seen what happened to Notch in the interim. But
yeah.
At the time, yeah, like, of course we wanted that. We wanted to be that huge. We wanted to be dominating the cultural conversation. And we also launched a Kickstarter not that long after the huge Double Fine one that I think probably launched 1 million indie Kickstarters.
Oh, sure.
And ours failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was for Broken Age? Yeah, Broken Age, which they don't think they had a title yet at that point.
No, I was just going to say that was the one where people were angry about how successful it was, but also, which comparatively today sounds quaint, I guess, but I think they're just calling it adventure or something. I don't know, like I feel like it's a huge part of the stuff that's in the air between developers or like even like coverage sometimes, and also coverage of Kickstarters, like I don't know, it's not, I mean, maybe it's professional jealousy, like I'm much more familiar with it on the writer's side of thing, and sort of like the ways that some writers are like rooting for other writers to fail, or the way that like writers think other writers like don't deserve the jobs or the money that they're getting. I mean, I think it's just like a very human, understandable thing. But I guess like, I don't know. I guess just because it's just, I don't know. Like I'm sure it exists on the developer side. I'm not really interested in like asking you for gossip like that. But I feel like, there are there have been those stories of like, oh, the indie game millionaires, which is many years ago.
I forgot about
Well, I
forgot about indie game the movie.
Sorry,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. Indie game the movie.
Yeah, I forgot about that movie. Also came out when we were developing the game too, so that was also bad influence. Like, you don't need to see stuff like that. Like, because really, it was interesting. Like, our game was a modest indie success, and that is a weird niche to be in. I don't think there were very few of those back then. I don't think there's probably a lot of them now. Like, we had a small community of people who really liked the game. We had a decent little bit of income coming in that we had to supplement with, contract work and other things. But like, we were earning money on that game for years, even if we never became a smash hit or anything. And that's something that was definitely not something we expected. And I think that's also a strange place to be in, like, emotionally, because, you can deal with like crushing defeat. Like, I've dealt with plenty of crushing defeats before. It's not fun, but you can feel sorry for yourself at least, and then you move on too, right? You don't have to stay with the defeat. But when you're like kind of succeeding and kind of not, it's a little hard to know, like how much do you really want to put into this? Like, is this, because like you're probably not going to get this close to success with something brand new. And the longer you spend on it, you end up in this kind of sunk cost fallacy too. So, and it was more complex because there were three of us. So it wasn't just like, if it was just one of us working on it, then those are all internal conversations. You can be more honest about your feelings, but none of us talked about pulling the plug when we were still making money on it. Because why would you?
Right. Why would you communicate about what you're pouring so much of yourselves into? I don't know. It is a weird like tunnel vision trench mentality. I mean, is this like a thing that like you've seen be articulated, like this degree of like professional jealousy that exists in the indie space? Is that even a thing that like merits coverage? Like I'm trying to be mindful of like how many of these questions I've asked you that are, I think, like a touch further personal than I usually go. So if it's like something you want to talk about, you're not obligated to open up.
No, I just wish I had some juicier gossip for you, but I don't. And if I did, it would be 5 years old.
Well, the statute of limitations would be up. Now would be the time to hear about it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like that we probably felt some jealousy of some. Like, there definitely were some games that got big that we didn't think were very good.
Yeah.
I do remember when what ended up being a huge debacle, that Yogg's Cast adventure game Kickstarter.
Yeah.
When that happened, I was jealous of that, because I was just like, I've never heard of this podcast. Like, I guess it's really popular. Their game looks like all over the place. It barely seems to be adding anything to the Minecraft formula. It's like you could do all this with mods. So what exactly are they? Why are they reinventing the wheel? So I would not say I was vindicated by what ended up happening, which
it got canceled,
of you
right?
Listening who don't know, yeah, the whole thing just fell apart. The money vanished. Apparently it was just seemed to be just this one developer who was doing most of the work on it, and apparently like destroyed his life. Essentially, it's really pretty sad. And I guess a good example of how some of those bad industry practices don't just exist in the AAA space. There's like a pressure to put all of yourself into what you're working on.
Yeah,
that exists outside of that. That's just implicit.
Right. I mean, time and time again. I mean, it's. I think it's maybe unfair that like one game gets to be the the key example of it. Like I guess maybe Duke Nukem Forever, for example. Although certainly there are others. But like I do hear also from people who leave games, like they usually tell me like, oh, they're much happier now. They make way more money. They have better work-life balance. And I don't know if it's a cliche or if it's true. Like, I wonder, like, I mean, I'm curious if that, I mean, you don't need to tell me what your salary is. Like, I guess I'm curious if that's been your experience. But part of me wonders, like, is it maybe just that, like, the problems in other industries are not easier, but maybe they have clearer solutions as opposed to building a video game? Like maybe that's part of it. Maybe that's why it just feels like it's less, life or death, and it doesn't like take such a toll on your soul. Maybe.
I have thought about that a bit because, like I mentioned, I really like the company I work for now, and I have thought sometimes like, could this company and our culture, could this exist in video games or even in any creative field? I'm not sure it could. There's something to be said. So we're a tech consultancy. We're fairly small. We're called Table XI. We're in Chicago, and we build software and do design work and user research and a lot of other stuff for various companies and industries. And I think the fact that we have this diverse realm of clients and industries we work in, and also the fact that we make money, like we're pretty successful, pretty consistently in a way that I think it's just really, really hard to be in any kind of creative space, unless you're Disney, I guess. Like you just own everything. Although they had their lean years too, so I don't know. Easy for me to say, right? I just like having that. Honestly, just having money coming in, like it makes so much of a difference. When you're not desperate, when you can spend time investing in your culture, when you can spend time on continuing education for people, when you can, put a lot of time and effort into diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which I've been a part of at my company, like stuff like that. Like that takes time, and it takes space, and it takes money. Like the money is such a cushion around things, and I think it does allow people to be, build more of what they want. Like I think everybody would love to. Well, not everybody, but like I think a lot of people would really like to work in a company like mine. I think that people in video games would love to work in a company like mine. I just don't know how you could do it because I just remember so much of that kind of. You're always teetering on the edge of desperation. I feel like at any moment, everything could have collapsed for us.
In games,
and I don't even think that's. Yeah, and I don't think that's unique to being a small team. There were only 4 of us actually, if you count our community manager, which you should.
Yeah.
Everything is kind of like a risk. Like there are no like easy. You can't just experiment with something. This is kind of what I was getting at earlier, right? There's just not a lot of room to fail. You can't fail for very long, I guess. Like that's part of the problem. You can't fail long enough to see what you're failing at and then make that course correction. It's really hard to do that because by that point you probably just don't have any money left and you have to quit.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I haven't heard that in a long time. It's a very good way of putting it, but like I think I remember hearing maybe 1.5 generations ago of hardware cycles, it being said that like a company a company can't put out 2 failures. Like they can't have 2 flops. One flop they can absorb, another one would crush them. And then I guess it stands to reason that like in over the next 10 to 12 years, people kind of feel like there's just been a lot of sameness as far as what's coming out of bigger companies. And then of course there's been the rise of weirdly expecting the people with even less money to make the bigger risks, and then like championing indies for being like the creative heart of the of the ecosystem when they can they have the least money, they can take the least risks, but like in some weird ways the most is expected from them. But maybe
that's a really good point.
Maybe that's just coming from the industry though. Like I feel like the average person who does not spend most of their time going online thinking and talking about games, I bet you that's probably not their perception, but I'm not a person like that and I don't know a person like that, so I don't know.
I wonder how much indie games really. I guess so. I'm part of a little comics group. That's actually the reason I'm on Discord is because we have a little Discord. That's a really nice little community I found of local artists in Chicago. We used to meet up frequently at the library. Now we can't do that, so we just do everything online. But we're all pretty big into games in various ways, and like a lot of us were just talking about that itch.io racial justice bundle that came out last week, I think.
Yeah.
So there's definitely, because I was about to say, like, I don't know how much people who don't work in games care that much about indie games versus big games, but, these are some friends of mine who are not, well, a few of them have dabbled in game development, but they've never done it professionally, and they're still interested in indie games. So, and obviously, like, indie comics, indie games, you can see where there would be a lot of overlap there in terms of philosophies and interests. But yeah, I think that is a good point. I think that indie games, probably. Well, I don't know. Like, there's got to be so many brilliant little games out there that I've just never played. Like maybe they have solved a whole bunch of problems with, like they've made these amazing strides that just nobody knows. I mean, it was funny actually. Right before we started recording, I went on to is it itch.io, itch.io? I don't know what to call it. You know what I'm talking about, itch.
You're good. I mean, I've heard it called all of the above. I think itch or itch.io is most commonly.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the average person coming across this interview will know it, but the average person who doesn't come across this interview will not.
Yeah.
Which I guess is part of what we're talking about. Yeah. So you went on to itch just before we hopped on. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to look at my page for the game I put up. I put up in early 2015, shortly after I stopped working on Deep World. It's called Lantern, and I searched for it, and there are like 9 other games called Lantern. And it's just like maybe really just because itch is like they're not nearly as huge as Steam, I'm sure, but like that's how big they are that you can have like 10 games called Lantern, and mine's buried in there somewhere. So even if you're searching for my game, if you don't know my name, you might have a lot of trouble finding it. You're probably not going to play through all those games. That's just shows you the scope of the discoverability problem. But that's everything though, right? That's definitely a problem in comics. It's a problem in all entertainment now.
Right.
And I have no idea how to solve it.
Well, that's okay. I'm not going to ask you to solve any problems tonight.
Okay, good.
Although, well, maybe. I'm not planning to. I mean, this sort of connects with like some of the stuff we were emailing about. It's. I don't know that I've heard much about this from someone who's kind of moved on from the space. But like, what is your relationship like with games media now compared to when you had stuff that you were thinking might have the chance of getting covered?
I'm definitely more selective about what I play, not about what I buy, because I buy way too many games and then I never play them. But I know a lot of people have that problem.
Yes.
But
they do.
I think that, yeah, I think that I don't feel like my relationship as a player has changed much. I think I don't feel much pressure to analyze game design choices anymore, although I rarely did back then either. If they didn't specifically relate to our game, like if I played an awesome single-player stealth game, like it didn't apply to our game, which, by the way, was a 2D Minecraft alike, but it was also an MMO, so we had a lot of social features in it. And it was not at all based on Terraria. That game actually did come out before we started developing it, but we had not heard of it, and it didn't start getting big until we were already like pretty far into our path. So people often accused us of ripping off Terraria, but we were ripping off Minecraft not Terraria. So get it right.
Let's get the record straight here.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I really hated was looking at monetization and looking at other like mobile games. Because again, this is why I was not driving the the engine of business and commerce at our company. Because my two friends they could attend a GDC, you know, they could go to the talks with all the people in suits, you know, where everyone smelled nice. Yeah. And I was at all the talks where everyone was in hoodies and smelled terrible, including me. And I was there for the indie community. I really just wanted to meet other developers. I wanted to talk shop and like, you know, be a part of like the scene. That was what was really exciting to me. Which is something I have reflected on a bit, going back to what I said earlier about kind of like trying to figure out how ambitious I still am and whether or not I still want to really try to quote unquote make something of myself. I'm trying to break that down to like, why would I want to be a successful creator? Like, what about that do I think would be good and appealing? And part of it is community. Like, and I'm like, you know, I can get that anyway. Like, I don't need to be, you know, famous or super successful to be part of a fun artistic community. In fact, in some ways that might be a detriment. But that's what sort of the dream for me was like, I would love to just be able to hobnob with some of these people who I really respect and be on their level. I'd love for them to come to me and ask me questions and just to feel like we're kind of on that same plane. But you can kind of get that anyway, actually, I discovered at GDC, because game developers are not famous. You can just walk right up to them. And I did. Anyway,
I have found,
I'm getting very...
Yeah, no, I have found that you can pretty much email anybody, and you can... it helps if you set up an interviews project, but you can pretty much ask for an hour, pretty much anybody's time. Although I don't make games, but like I think there's probably, you know, a distinction between a closed doors conversation about craft as opposed to you know, the conceits of a, hey, can I schedule time with you on Discord and ask you general questions as a conversation between two total strangers? Yeah, I don't know. I think I can't begin to theorize other than like, yeah, that's like, so yeah, like relationship with games, like, but I'm also curious, like relationship with like the sites that cover games, because I feel like this sort of basic stuff you're talking about here is like that kind of reverence that like creators have for one another or their relationship with each other. Like I feel like I don't feel like that's a thing you would read about on one of quote unquote the sites, which isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but I have just kind of observed there are a lot of basic things about the basic momentum behind people who make games and continue to make games that, like, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be a thing that like is examined, or maybe it's hard to monetize examining. Like that's just some of my deal, but like I guess like I'm also curious like what's your relationship like with those sites now, and what do you notice if you do pay attention to them about like patterns of what they do cover and what they don't cover?
It's interesting you bring that up, yeah, because I'm trying to, like, I still read Kotaku pretty regularly. I read Polygon pretty regularly. I still read Critical Distance, which I think I, long ago in our first, like, email exchanges mentioned I'd seen you through there.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that, so I'm still kind of, like, that was all the stuff I read back then. I was on Twitter more, which I'm not anymore, just for my own mental health. I think that was a good decision, but, so there was that. I guess I saw like live conversations happening between people that I don't anymore. But I'm still theoretically getting a lot of this information. And so why do I feel so completely disconnected from like the game making scene? And it probably is because I'm not really reading any articles about indie game devs anymore.
Well,
maybe they're out there and I'm ignoring them.
Yeah, are you not seeing them anymore, or are you just not reading them anymore?
I don't know, because I never thought about it, but now I'm kind of curious. It's probably a little of both, but I'm trying to think, like, and I think that, yeah, there was a big focus on it. like it's kind of like in the early days of Miramax before that story got super ugly. When like indie film in the mid '90s was something like this big trendy thing, and indie movies had been around forever at that point. But like suddenly everyone noticed, and they particularly noticed these new filmmakers who were making movies in a particular style, which is usually like hyper violent, pop culture referencing things. And that was like this cool thing for a bit, and then it kind of died down. And I feel like games might have had a similar moment with the popularity of Minecraft and with Indie Game the movie, where briefly there was a bit of focus on creators, and again, people who were creating a very particular kind of game. Most of these games were like, retro throwbacks to childhood favorites of that generation. So of course they're, very accessible thing to like make a movie about. And I don't know that really kept up after that. As far as just this like interest in, like there was of course not much novelty after that point either, because that was what was different about indie games in 2010, or I actually don't know when did Indie Game the movie come out? It was probably like 2012 or something.
2012, which I only know for a fact because I had a conversation with somebody else this afternoon, and they remembered exactly, and they had some interesting observations. It was an unrelated call, not about that movie, but they were kind of observing that like it feels like the pendulum has swung the other way since then, where like kind of the cult of personality, where it's like if you were to do that movie today, like who would you put in it, other than Jonathan Blow again? Like who are all these new people that are coming out now, and like what kind of games would they be? And if you're, I don't know, I don't need to get too much into the weeds if you're not as up on everyone or whatever, but that was sort of a thing that he was theorizing, I think is interesting, and I don't know if it's like fair to ask you about, but it's a thing I'm still sort of mentally processing. But anyway, that's how I know 2012 though.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess the difference between that and the sort of indie like fad of the 90s film, I guess, was that indie games really in that form like had not really been around that long, or had not been that accessible up until that point. Game Maker had been around for a while. People, like Cave Story came out in I think like 2005. So like that kind of retro game made by a single person was possible, but you had to be really, really skilled at that point to do it. And like it really was a point where game creation was getting much, much more accessible for a lot of people. Twine was probably getting popular around that same time, which was a huge thing for a lot of people. So I guess now it's like, what exactly is the novelty factor? Now it's been a while, and these accessible tools have been around for a while.
Yeah.
And it's interesting though, you mentioned the like who would be in an indie game the movie, and I'm trying to think, well, what's a big indie game that I played recently? And I thought of Hollow Knight. And like, I don't know who made Hollow Knight. I think it was like 3 people, but I don't know their names, and I don't even know what the name of their studio is. Like, that to me is kind of striking, because something like Hollow Knight could have easily been an indie game the movie, right? It very much would have fit in there. Like a small team, influenced by childhood games. So is it just because there's more people doing it now? Is it because these people, Phil Fish certainly was like a kind of interesting and controversial figure. So he made although he wasn't really in the movie, I think he started pissing people off after the movie. but certainly Jonathan Blow has been very, he's happy to like give out these very polarizing opinions and make himself an interesting, a center of conversation. And maybe it's just that some of these newer developers just don't have interest in doing that. Maybe because being at the center of conversation in the game sphere can be a horrible, horrible place to be, as we've all seen in the intern in those
I've heard
years.
Heard a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Well, these comparisons to film are always interesting. And I think like there was a point you were making about I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I sort of took it to mean that like the lineage of games criticism sort of disappearing. like you were talking about how like, people bring up conversations in games without realizing that there's writing to refer to from a decade earlier. And like, I think you made the comparison to like Roger Ebert, continuing a conversation from Pauline Kael about the same movie from the 40s. And like, as you said, like you rarely see that sort of thing in games criticism, which you think is a shame. So like what do you feel like, what is that a function of, that rarely happens? And what's maybe lost as a result?
Yeah, I don't know how much that might be true in film criticism now too. It's like there were, like, if I'm harkening back, whatever. If I'm talking about Roger Ebert, I'm talking about Pauline Kael. I'm talking about the 80s and the 70s maybe, and like times when you had to be published in a newspaper, maybe a magazine. Maybe you had some books, and that was it. That was your entire way of getting this stuff out. So there were not as many people in the conversation because it was such a high barrier to entry. And now, just like with games themselves, games writing has no barrier to entry. The trick is just getting noticed, staying online in some form. And the fact that so many of this criticism and these writings are on little blogs or sites like 1UP that just disappear entirely and don't even necessarily get archived. Like even commercial sites people were making money off of, there's no guarantee that stuff's going to stick around. I think that hurts it a lot. Like, it's hard to know that this stuff exists, and even if you do, you might go looking for it and find it gone. So that was not really the case probably with film criticism in 1990.
I used to write for 1UP, and I don't know that even I remember everything I did. And I did some weird stuff for them. The only thing I really remember was just a dumb list of like gaming's top 25 landlords tied to some Animal Crossing thing, which I think was like I was
gonna say I didn't even think of any besides Animal Crossing.
It was like a dumb in-joke assignment / challenge. Like, can you do it, David? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, I can. If you pay me, I could do it. I don't know though. I mean, like, do you think like is something lost? I mean, I think it does speak to like maybe a certain circular nature of the loudest conversations in games where, I mean, I've heard it said like you can get all like media theory-y on it where like I've talked to people, I don't know, someone who worked on Fallout 3, like he sometimes emails me and it's like, oh, look what we're relitigating again on Twitter. And he sort of speculated, like, is it because, like, games, like, you build from scratch, you have to start all over again? Like, do we have to start from scratch all over again on the way we talk about games? And I feel like it's partly what you're talking about. I think it's also partly, like, this kind of revolving door where people do just sort of leave. But I think it's also, like, a function of, like, just the nature of like youth and like the fact that people tend not to care about history. And so like
that's very true.
But I think too, like though, if critics aren't really continuing on in that tradition, then it's like we're always sort of patting ourselves on the back for thinking we were the first to think something. And I think it winds up alienating a lot of people, and I think it does drive some of that like professional jealousy that I was talking about. But I find most people, their reaction is like, just stop reading all those sites. Although I have found, even if you do that, you still hear about like the worst case stories that are on there, or the things that are. It's like what happens on Yelp. Like even if you tune out, somehow if you're still open to those frequencies, you hear about the worst and the best. You never hear like maybe what's close to, like what's actually going on. I don't know. I mean, maybe, I don't know. It's hard to get all theoretical on like, oh, well, if critics did this, then how would it be different? But I think it's very much a thing, though, like what you pointed out.
Yeah, I think that, to your point, people don't always care about history, and especially if they're like younger people who just might not be interested in the perspective of somebody writing for a game site 15 years ago, and I can kind of understand that, right? That is a particular audience that they had back then. Like, do you really need to be able to offer that criticism? I don't know, but I think that I would like to see people understand the context of, like, especially when they're talking about older games, like, understand the context things were made in, because that is a really hard thing to communicate after the fact. And it sucks that that's what gets lost. Like, something that really annoys, this is just like a general pet peeve of mine. I really hate when people talk about media from like 20 years ago and they talk about how prescient it was. It's like, or how incredibly, relevant it still is. Like, my God, I can't believe this. Like, I heard that a lot about Final Fantasy VII recently when the remake came out. It's like, it's not prescient. Like it was like, what, because it talks about corporations being evil and destroying the environment. It's like, that was happening 20 years ago. Like, it's not prescient. It's just a problem we still have. Like, that's not, and because the fact that they just focus on how it applies to right now, and they're only seeing it through the lens of right now, that's incredibly telling to me. And it's like, and also the sort of supposition that it's only interesting because it's relevant right now. Like, what if it was referring to a problem that we don't see the same way or isn't in the same shape now? Like, why is that less interesting? I think that's
yeah.
I think that's what gets lost, is that the stuff is probably more valuable in giving you a piece of, like, what was going through people's minds and what the conversation was like when these things came out, or when this conversation first came up. That can just give you a historical, context that might make you, I don't know, might make you reflect differently on how it looks now.
I feel like, there's a couple things. I have said this before, but I haven't said it to you, and I don't think I've said it in one of these interviews, so I could have gotten away with seeming like I'm not repeating myself, but I had to come clean. But I feel like, as sort of like a recovering critic myself, although I guess, I don't know, people describe what I'm doing now as cultural criticism. So I guess, I don't know. That's a whole other different path and struggle in my deal, and we can do it when you interview me. It's, which you don't have to do, I'm just joking. It's, I always felt like for people who are working critics, like, after they've worked for 10 years doing it, like, they should come clean about, like, all the personal demons they were exercising and, like, taking out on other people's stuff, and be like, okay, look, here was my deal. I apologize.
That would be,
because I think that's like a thing. Like, it's a definite.
That would be
thing.
Fascinating.
I guess maybe I should do it, but I don't know. It's that window.
Yeah, but that would be great, though. And that's something you don't get. You don't get people picking up conversations with years of reflection in between them and going back to them much. That, I think, is something that would be really, really cool. Especially when people got more personal and when they had, like, more of themselves in a particular thing they were writing about, a game or something.
Yeah, there was that whole new games journalism thing, which, whatever, but that does feel like that would be another part of it, right? Is, like, turning it back in on itself to sort of figure out, like, what are we really talking about? I was just going to say, like, I feel like the older I get, and we're the same age, the older I get, the less I feel like I want to state an opinion about a thing, because it's like, I'm sure there's context I don't have, that I want to get, like, especially, like, the further back you go and you expose yourself to certain things, like, you do realize, like, what a continuum everything is in. So it is definitely tempting, and I get why it sounds smart to say, like, for example, as you were saying, like, oh, Final Fantasy VII is so prescient. It's not, and I guess maybe you can make the case that's not really, the job of a person who's criticizing games, but it definitely does sort of hold back ways of thinking about it, or sort of like ways of, that's sort of the problem, though. Like, I think, like, I have this feeling that, like, deep down we're all kind of, like, embarrassed of games, and so we feel this need to, like, talk really smartly about them and prove that they're, like, really a big deal. And I think that
I think
that telegraphs some criticism too. You know, why else would you see that word in a review at that time?
Yeah, I think that's something that I don't think games culture ever really shook in, like, and it took a lot of forms. You know, I think a lot of the defensive gatekeeping around games, or for me or for this particular kind of player, was like that. But there were also more benign forms, like what you just described, like talking very highly and intelligently about stuff that maybe really isn't that deep.
Right.
And I still think, I think I mentioned The Last of Us Part 2 just came out, and I think I mentioned how overrated I thought the first one was in my email exchange with you.
Right.
Something I've been thinking about a lot because of the new game, and I'm just like, I don't think anyone would really think this was that great of a movie if they just watched it as a movie. And you can go on YouTube and watch the entire first game as a movie, and lose almost nothing.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you can watch The Road.
Or you could do that, yeah.
Well, I had the experience. Before COVID, as COVID was hitting, I did finally go and play the first Last of Us, and then I did watch that movie, and I was like, oh, I mean, see, that's like such a microcosm of what I was talking about, you know? Like I don't know that it necessarily detracts from the game, but it makes you look at it differently if, you know, you see that movie, or you read the book, or you go back and you go back and you go back. And I guess this is just us shaking our fist at the kids today.
Yeah, I guess I feel like there's less of an excuse now, though. Like, the technology is absolutely at a point where, like, there's nothing constraining you from telling a good story. And some games have done really, really good stories and, like, really deep, meaningful things. I don't want to act like nobody's done this, but I still think that we laud a lot of things that are kind of just mediocre or, you know, pretty good, because our standards are just still surprisingly low, and I don't know why. Like, especially because, you know, a lot of us are old now. We're not young whippersnappers anymore playing these things. Like, we should have higher standards, I think.
Not us though, right? We're still young and cool.
Yes, I'm not talking about us. You and me. I mean us collectively, meaning not me.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, no. No, but I mean, I'm old. Like, my parents were it's weird to think of how many signifiers of, like, adulthood my parents were totally just doing when they were 37 that I just am not at all. And it's probably not really that meaningful. It's just kind of funny. Like, they did not watch movies based on toys from their childhood. Like, that just wasn't a thing they were doing.
It's we're in the golden age of TV, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's what they said. I mean, I guess maybe you sort of answered it, like, I was going to ask, like, you know, what do you think people who champion games have wrong about games? And I guess we've kind of been maybe circling this question anyway, like, kind of what we were talking about is, like, just to sort of paraphrase, like, we were talking about, like, lower standards and, like, kind of coming from a place of being embarrassed about games. Like, is there some other shade on it you think we haven't touched on, as far as, like, people who are shouting from the highest mountains, mm-hmm. like, this is why games matter, this is why they're great?
Yeah, I think they matter to the people who are shouting that because they have that emotional response to them for whatever reason, right? Like, they're just not able to convey that to people. That's why they're shouting. That's why they're frustrated. They want other people to feel what they feel, because it's that important to them.
Yeah.
I think that maybe that's partly that it's hard. Your relationship with the game is always going to be a little bit more personal. Well, I don't know if I should say that, but you know, your experience with the game is always going to be unique to you somehow, right? Unless it's an extremely linear game. If there's any kind of dynamic aspect to it at all, then you are the only person who had that playthrough of the game, and it might not change the experience dramatically, and it usually doesn't change the story of the game at all. But it was still your thing, your playthrough. Which is not really what you get. You definitely don't get as much with movies. You get it a little bit with books, I guess, because you're imagining stuff in your own head. But books have, you know, not struggled for legitimacy in a long time, so I don't know if that's a good comparison. But I think that maybe that's part of it, is just like there's always going to be something really subjective and something singular about your experience, and unless other people play games, the same games you do, or for the same kind of reasons that you do, they might just not get it at all, and they won't want to get it because like you can't convince them that they're missing out on something if they don't understand it.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's part of it.
I mean, for a long time, I mean, I don't know if it's because I have a media background or what. I think years ago I used to think, and I think that's even part of why I started doing these interviews, is there are like questions I have, stories I would want to tell about games, but I just don't have the opportunity to hear about them or report on them. And we were talking about Animal Crossing before. Like, I guess I'm just saying, like, I don't know. Like, I think I've just become increasingly skeptical. Like, if that stuff is going to change, it's probably not going to come from media. Like we were emailing about the Animal Crossing sort of just surge of coverage. You know, like kind of like this bunch of articles like about how everyone plays games now. And I really appreciate like you're mentioning like there's actually a long history of these articles. Like they did it for Farmville, they did it for Candy Crush, and I wonder why this is like perpetually a thing people discover, forget, and then discover in those circles. But I think it's weird that like it really hasn't shifted in like 10, 15 years from those vantage points of being like the Animal Crossing stuff is in and of itself like a good lens on it, because I looked it up before, like the last time they covered an Animal Crossing game, like New York Times or whatever, like it went from being like, hey, games are a thing you can distract your kids with, to 10, 15 years later, hey, games are a thing you can distract yourself with. Like it hasn't moved more in all that time, and I don't know if that really matters to people in games because they just sort of see the optics of it being covered there. But like I rarely see it articulated where it's like, well, it's not like no one's ever surprised when a movie or a TV show has a cultural impact, but if a game does, it's still like, what the hell? So I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what will bump those standards up that you and I are talking about.
I think if anything does it, I think it will be, well, theoretically we should already be there. Maybe we're not. Yeah, I'm just thinking like that thing I talked about kind of like, I think I said accessibility, but literacy might be a better term for it.
Huh.
How confident and like easy, like, are you at controlling, a imaginary character in 3D space? Like that question right there is can determine how many games you can actually play in there. If you can't do that, there are many thousands that you can't really play or enjoy. But then, of course, there's these generations now who grew up with that kind of control. I think I mentioned my wife played, the Nintendo the NES when she was young, and can still pick up and play a 2D side-scrolling game. She has that muscle memory and that understanding of it. But I've tried and failed to get her into 3D games for years, and it just does not stick, and she's just not interested.
Yeah.
So I feel like once that shift has gone far enough and enough people have grown up with that kind of gameplay experience, then that might be where at least you start to see this lack of surprise that a game is like a big cultural event, because there's no question if people can control it or not, if they can actually play it.
I think it's like,
but
yeah, I mean, I think it's so tempting to say like, oh, well, it'll take care of itself in time, but I think people forget it's not some like given thing. Like, yes, it probably will take time, but it really depends what that time is filled with.
Yeah, and of course the advent of the popularity of touchscreens seemed to be this whole new direction for games, but they didn't really. I don't think that dramatically changed the way we interact with games. Really, beyond like once the first few years had happened and people had gotten a sense of what kind of game experiences work in that format, what don't, then you don't see a lot beyond that of like real change. And the game controller for the PS5. Actually, I haven't even looked at the controller specifically, but I'll bet it looks a lot like the PS4, which looks an awful lot like the PS1.
No,
kind of figured out that
it's a different color.
Oh, okay. Well, that's totally different then. Never mind.
Sorry.
No.
No, you're good. I'm sorry. Well, yeah. Listen, I just have one last question for you here. Unless I know we jumped around a bunch. Was there something you wanted to mention before we start wrapping it up?
I just wanted to complain about The Last of Us, and I got to do that, so I'm good.
Oh, you're good. And on the eve of the new ones, or the eves of the new ones release, so
Yeah.
so you get to plan.
Yeah, so it's timely.
I'm happy. That's why it's a good thing. It took us 5 years to arrange this interview. I could tee you up for that.
Yeah, I wonder what I would have complained about in 2015. I have no idea what. I'm sure there was a recent game I played then that I thought was overrated and I could have complained about.
Well, on that note, let me broaden out here a bit and just sort of ask you a question I ask everyone, which is just, what do you think video games have accomplished?
I think I'm like thinking back to the beginning of video games, which maybe is too far, but I think I keep wanting to qualify everything I'm about to say. That's why I keep stopping, because it's like, well, they've added this whole they've created this entirely new art form in which there's interactive entertainment, but then I'm like, but they still don't quite know what to do with the interactivity aspect of it as far as like making things emotionally resonant. And again, there's a lot of games that do that really, really well, but I don't think like that overall vocabulary is extended to all of them.
Well, so if you don't qualify it, like what's your knee-jerk instinct response? Like
my knee-jerk response is like they're still going somewhere. They have not, even though they have kind of plateaued in many ways in terms of like the way they tell stories, the way they expect you to interact with them, the kind of audiences they're going for have not opened up quite as much as I think they should have, at least with like big shiny console releases.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they've succeeded. They've accomplished it, like getting everyone to play them, really. Even though we're still seeing those articles like people play games, it's like no, pretty much everybody plays them in some form, or at least understands like how, like what they offer. They. But I don't feel like they've quite come into their own yet, even as old as they are. I think there's still something that's going to change, maybe very subtly. I really want to see what, the generation of game developers who grew up with Minecraft instead of with Super Mario Brothers, what their retro throwbacks look like, because I think those are going to be really interesting. I also think that AI is this kind of shadowy figure in the corner, and I'm not talking about like enemies moving around a map AI. I mean I was just earlier today playing around with this these generated songs, that OpenAI released that can you can give it lyrics and it will give you an Elvis Presley song kind of cobbled together from his back catalog, and it's crazy. Stuff like that, generative stuff that you don't control and don't fully understand, could have a lot of applications in games, and I think it's going to have a lot of applications all over the place, but particularly in games. And I haven't really seen people doing much with that yet, and I think that'll be really interesting. So I think that even though it feels like the technology is kind of at a bit of a standstill, like looking at those PS5, release trailers, it's like, this looks like, a little bit better than a PS4 game. Like, it's not the huge leap that we used to have between console generations, but there are still huge technological breakthroughs that I think are going to happen in the next few decades that we don't even see coming. And that might change interactivity in games quite a bit. Although I think that it'll take a while for people's thinking to catch up with the possibilities of the technology, because, that you just have to play around with it and experiment for a while. So I feel like they're still like video games are teenagers, they're still figuring themselves out. Yeah, that's about as much as I can say.